I'm going to say goodnight. It's probably ready for me to go to bed, I guess. So as was mentioned this morning, we are going to be in the small book of Ruth. And so while you are navigating your way to this shortish book between Judges and 1 Samuel, I will give you a little bit of my own history. And maybe some reasons why this book is meaningful for me. So, at the age of 14, October 1994, it was a Thursday. I remember this because I was wearing my JV football jersey, number 45. Morning class, it's about 9:30. And one of the sheriff's deputies walked into the school and found me. And, for a 14-year-old kid who never does anything wrong, this was weird. And so to come to that point, my dad had battled leukemia for about 3.5 years. Had a bone marrow transplant, was in remission, had gone through all the chemotherapy, radiation treatment, and for anyone who knows what that torture is like, it burns you from the inside out. It destroys any immune system that you have. Before he had gotten leukemia, he was a drill and rig foreman. Worked for Amoco for a bunch of years, loved to be outside, loved to work. And so that's what I did growing up. All the time was just work. Our Saturdays, if we weren't at church, and on the weekends, we were working. So to be bedridden in a hospital, having to endure all of these treatments, was torture for my dad. So when he was in remission, he was eager to get back outside and get to work, even though that most of his strength had left him. I still remember times where we were outside and he would kind of stumble because his legs, his body just did not have the same strength that it once did. And because he was so eager and so stubborn, he got a cold, and that rather than going to the doctor, that cold quickly turned into pneumonia, and then he quickly died because of his lungs filled up with fluid. And so the sheriff's deputy that came to school that morning was coming to take me to the hospital, where the ambulance had rushed my dad into the emergency room. And so I had gotten there. I think I was there about 30 minutes, before the doctor came out and said that there was nothing that they could do. They couldn't save him. So for a 14-year-old kid who was, loved his dad and loved working with his dad, it's kind of like, well, what's going on? So there was certainly a time there where I kind of wondered where God was in that moment. But God is always faithful. And so fortunately for me, my grandparents lived very close. And so I was very close with my grandfather, who I lived with some of my brothers, while my dad was 4 hours away in a hospital during his treatment. So we lived with our grandparents for about a year. So I was very close to my grandfather. In probably late 1998, while I was in college, I get a call that my grandfather has leukemia. But it is a different form of leukemia, and it is much more aggressive. So by May the next year, before I could even see my grandpa, he died. And that one, hard enough losing a dad, and then 4 years later, losing a godly man who I just looked up to in every way. So that was 1999. Jan and I would get married later that year, and so he did not see me get married. 4 years later, Jana's dad died of leukemia. 2003, January. Yet another different type of leukemia. He did not have to endure the same kind of chemotherapy. So by that time, there were actual drugs that he was able to take, and so prolonged his life for several years. He felt good until towards the end, it seemed to all hit him at once. So in a 10-year period, there were times for us where we struggled. Yeah, I remember the tears, the heartache, but I also remember, for Jana going through it, being able to say, man, God has put me through this twice. I know exactly what you're going through. And then just being able to be there for her because the experience that I had gone through gave meaning to my tragedy. It allowed me to look back at what I had gone through in a different way. And I became thankful for that. And as hard as those times were in our lives, I still don't think they were the hardest. But all along the way, though, God opened and closed the doors that I could not see. Joining the military was willingly giving up control over where we went. And this came only after a time where we went through all of these things so that God could bring me to a place where I could completely and totally 100% submit to the Lordship of Christ, whatever it meant. God, I'd been through so much in my life, and I've seen how you can use the worst of circumstances for your glory. So I trust you. Whatever it looks like, I'm willing to walk through the doors that you open. And so over the last year, Jen and I have spent time on the back porch marveling at how we ended up right here. Of all the things that had to happen just the right way to bring us to this place. I'm sure that you can all think of times in your life where you've probably uttered that phrase, when it rains, it pours. You probably all have your own stories. Some of you may be going through that time right now. But in the midst of life, it's easy to come to a place where we do question things. This can look differently for us all. So some might say, like I did, why do I have to be the one to go through these things? What's the purpose or meaning of it? For some, you start to wonder, is God even there? We think if there is a God, then why doesn't he care about me? Or maybe there is no God. We start asking all of these questions because we aren't able to look past our present circumstance. And being in the midst of trouble and tragedy and strife blinds us to the bigger picture. And so it's amazing how our own perspectives about life and how involved God is in our life shapes our response to these difficult circumstances. So in the moment, as I said, we lose sight of that bigger picture. We lose sight of who God is. So there's an old Indian parable, and I'll read this. Many of you will probably have heard it. A group of blind men heard that a strange animal called an elephant had been brought to the town, but none of them were aware of its shape or form. Out of curiosity, they said, "We must inspect it and know it by touch, of which we are capable." So they sought it out, and when they found it, they groped about it. The first person whose hand landed on the trunk said, "This being is like a thick snake." For another one whose hand reached its ear, it seemed like kind of a fan. As for another person whose hand was upon its legs, it said, "The elephant is like a pillar. Its pillar is like a tree trunk." The blind man who placed his hand upon the side of the elephant said, "It's like a wall." And another who felt on its tail, described it as a rope. And the last felt its tusk, stating that the elephant is that which is hard, smooth, and like a spear. So all of these blind men are attempting to describe something from a very limited perspective. They're only able to define what they can feel. They're blind. They don't see the big picture. This parable reveals how our subjective experiences, right? Those are the experiences that we have and that we choose how we interpret it through our life. And they can be true in part, but they are rarely true in whole, right? So we are limited by our ability to see the big picture. There is only one who can, and that is God. God sees all, God knows all. And so this is the nature of God's providence, right? So providence is an important term that you might hear people use in terms of like good fortune or luck. I remember a time where I was driving early in the morning. I fell asleep at the wheel, and just before I hit the guardrail on a curve in the road, I woke up. I jerked the wheel to the left, did a complete 360 in the road, and ended up in the opposite lane facing in the direction of oncoming traffic. But luckily for me, it was still about 6:45 in the morning, and so there was a car coming over the hill but a ways away. And so I wasn't in any danger. I'd shakily steered the vehicle off to the side. And so I might say it was God's providence that I woke up just in the nick of time to be able to steer away, not hit the guardrail, to miss any kind of oncoming traffic and not be injured whatsoever. I could say that and I would probably be right. God's providence. But is God's providence only when good things happen? Or is it oftentimes equally present in moments that are bad? Because I've gone through bad things in my life, as you all have. But I have seen God work in those things, and I have seen God bring about good things in it. We cannot say that all things work together for good for those who love the Lord and according to his purpose, and only mean that all is all good. When we say all things work together for good, we're talking about both the good and the bad. And so that is God's providence. It's the doctrine of God's good governance over all things to fulfill his purposes. And so there's three components of that providence, right? That essentially things are the way they are because God made them that way. Make sense? Right? Things are the way they are because God created them that way. He gave them specific properties. The second component is that God keeps things operating according to how he created them. So, to put that in perspective, it's like we knew that there was going to be a snow and ice storm moving this way. We predicted it. We weren't prophets, right? The meteorologists aren't prophets. They didn't look into a crystal ball and determine what temperature it was going to be and if we were going to get snow or ice and what the prediction of how much, right? We have these things called weather patterns that, 2,000 years ago, they thought that was some sort of wind god, right? That was angry with them because they didn't sacrifice their child or whatever, right? So we know based on all of these properties and the factors about how and why God made things the way he did, we can start seeing evidence that God created things in an orderly fashion. Sometimes those orderly fashions result in a hurricane that produces devastation. Sometimes those orderly things like weather patterns creates things like ice storms and power goes out. And there are casualties. So we're not saying that God causes these things, but because of God's creation and because of weather patterns being what they are and all these properties, those things do happen. But God can use anything, and he can work in and through anything to bring about good and to accomplish his will and his good purpose. So, we need to understand, why am I talking about all this? We're supposed to be talking about Ruth. This is the longest introduction ever. So, we do need to understand God, that he can and will use any and all circumstances to bring about his good purposes, because that is the book of Ruth. We also need to understand Israel's history and culture and many of their laws to also understand the deep significance of Ruth. And so we'll get to all of that. But Ruth is ultimately a book about redemption, right? But in order to understand and grasp the overwhelming joy of redemption, we need to understand the depths of despair. We have to know that there is a deep, dark place from where we'll be saved, right? So, coming out of the book of Judges, Israel was lost. Huge understatement. So the period of Judges was essentially Israel's dark ages, 350 to 400 years of social and religious anarchy, characterized by this consistent term, this consistent phrase that you see throughout the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him. We could say that today, right? Everyone seems to do what is right in their own eyes. So, this book of Judges chronicles Israel's descent to the same depths of depravity as the Canaanites, the Amorites, all of these nations that they displaced in order to take hold of God's promised land. To push them out, they became those people. And why? Because if we remember, God told them, when I give this land into your hands, you must completely get rid of all of the cancer that is there. If you don't, there's going to be consequences, natural consequences. So we find those in Deuteronomy chapter 12, 29 through 31. It says, when the Lord your God annihilates the nations before you, which you are entering to take possession of, and you drive them out and live in their land, be careful not to be ensnared by their ways after they have been destroyed before you. Don't ask about their gods, asking, how did these nations worship their gods? I'll also do the same. You must not do the same to the Lord your God, because they practice every detestable act which the Lord hates for their gods. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. Deuteronomy chapter 20. However, in the cities of the nations of the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave anything alive that breathes. Completely destroy them, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God commands you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. So God is not this capricious deity that sits up there and says, just wipe these people out. He is protecting the nation of Israel. He's protecting God's people from themselves. Push them out. If you leave them behind, I know what's going to happen. I can see it, right? If you leave them there, they are going to influence you. They are going to persuade you and pull you into all of these detestable acts, and I don't want that for you. So, Joshua, right, leads the people into the promised land to take full possession of it. God is preparing the way, doing incredible things. What kind of incredible things is he doing? He's parting the Jordan River. He's providing manna from heaven until they get to a point where they can feed off the land. He brings down the walls of Jericho. And during the battle with the Amorites, he stops the sun and the moon. And then he calls down hailstones from heaven. And let's not forget about the 15 kings who decide to band together to take out this small band of people with no king. So 15 kings of nations, no king. The Bible describes their armies as a multitude as numerous as the sand on the seashore. But in Joshua 11:6, God tells him, don't be afraid of them, for at this time tomorrow I'll cause all of them to be killed before Israel. And he does. So the Israelites witnessed all of these things. And yet still, what is the book of Judges about? Time and time again, they still turned away from him and did what was right in their own eyes because, as Judges reminds us, there was no king in Israel. So it may seem logical from our perspective to look at Judges and say, okay, book of Judges tells us how bad things are because there was no king, emphasizes that, repeats it over and over again. So the next step should be, let's get into 1 and 2 Samuel. Let's see how God is raising up a king, right, to meet that need. But no, wait, not yet. We've got little old Ruth, right? So why Ruth? Good thing that our ways are not God's ways. He knows better. So we need to be reminded in the midst of all of this of just who God is. He's not some distant, all-powerful, unknowable deity who deals with nations, but that he's also this intimate, loving, merciful Father that is involved in the regular, mundane events of our life, sometimes joyous, sometimes tragic, but he's in the midst. He's in the midst of it all, working for his good purpose. And that's where Ruth comes in. It's like in the midst of it all, it's like, I want to make this personal to you. I want you to not get lost in all of these things that are going on, in this giant arc of history that's covering hundreds and hundreds of years in a chapter in your book. I want to take a moment so that you understand how much I love you and what I'm doing at the individual level to bring about my good purpose, not just for them, not just for Israel, but for you as well. So then Ruth, man, beautiful layered story that I feel like is a key that unlocks a prison cell. If Israel is in a deep, dark dungeon, black as night, with no hope whatsoever, Ruth is like the ray of light that is the sunshine and hope that unlocks the door and frees them up. So, finally, let's unlock the door. Sorry that was so long. So luckily, tonight we're only going to cover the first 5 verses of the first chapter. There's a lot in this book. Although it's short, it's kind of like the ocean, right? I can see the water, but it's not until I start to explore its depths that I see how vast it is, right? So almost kind of like that iceberg. You see a little bit of top, but there's so much underneath. So as we go through this, we're going to dive, like I said, into some of the culture and the laws that gives us context, and it's crucial to understanding its significance. We've already talked a little history, but there will be more to come. And then finally, as I mentioned, we're going to kind of talk about how this book fits into the overall arc of the biblical narrative that helps to point us to Jesus. So, finally, here we go. But wait, just remember, Judges, super dark, right? Super dark time. And so the book of Ruth begins in the midst of that time period. So we're going to get a glimpse into a very dark time for a family. And see how God is moving right in the midst of Israel's rebellion. Okay, so starting in the first 5 verses. So I'm just going to kind of go with the verse 1 here. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. So we said this was about redemption, right? See, Jack, I told you, this is really deep. But there's like you only got one sentence in. What could be there? It's a famine in the land, right? They're not growing anything. So we said this was a story of redemption, but it's also layers. So who needs to be redeemed? There was a famine in the whole land of promise. This was the promised land. There was never supposed to be a famine. God's provision was supposed to be for all time if his people were to follow him and just obey his commandments. But there was a famine, which means what? That God was bringing judgment on their disobedience. So Israel needed to be redeemed. We know this just by reading the book of Judges. But in case you forgot, here's Ruth telling you real quick, first sentence, Israel needs to be redeemed. Okay, so going to the second sentence. So 1b, a man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. Now we've got the second people that need to be redeemed, and that's this family. But how do we know that they need to be redeemed just after this one sentence? Well, that's because they left the promised land. So they're leaving the promised land, right? This land that's supposed to be flowing with milk and honey. And so they're leaving. They're departing, for them, the presence of God himself in the land. And they're leaving and going somewhere else to hopefully find food outside the land of promise. So they also need to be redeemed. It's so ironic that the name Bethlehem means house of bread. And they left because there was none. So with this family in tow, they leave Bethlehem and they head to Moab in search of food. So if you're leaving Bethlehem and you're going just a short jaunt, right, Middle East, right, down towards Moab, you're going to pass the nice, desolate Jericho Pass, travel through the Judean wilderness near the Dead Sea, and you're going to go back across the Jordan River before you find yourself in Moab. Now, if you go back to Judges, the first thing that the Israelites did to go into the land of promise, to the promised land, was they crossed the Jordan River. This family's going the other way. They're leaving. They're taking the step in the wrong direction, right? So they're almost retracing the Israelite steps out of the promised land and back into the wilderness. So it reminds me of the Israelites' first time in the wilderness after being saved and freed from bondage in Egypt, and they grumbled in the wilderness and said, "I would rather go back to bondage than be here in the wilderness." Even after seeing all that God had done for them, they were willing to return to bondage. And so I see the same thing here. They're willing to leave the land of promise and retrace those steps. Okay, so let's look at verse 2 and put some names to the family. So the man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the fields of Moab and settled there. So, in Jewish and Israelite culture, names were very significant, right? We see that all throughout the Old Testament, even to the end of the New Testament. So let's meet our lovely family. So Elimelech, his name means "my God is king," but there was no king at the time, and God certainly wasn't his king. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have left the land of promise. So there's a bit of an irony there for him. Naomi means pleasant or sweet, which is what the promised land should have been, but was no longer. And then don't forget there are two sons whose names are really close to words like, disease and mortality, right? So you can already see how this story is going to shape out, right? So this is kind of what they're left with in the family. So you have Elimelech, who's supposed to be the leader of the home, right? We've already established, right? God's not his king, and so he does what is right in his own eyes. Says there's no food in the promised land anymore, so I'm going to, I hear maybe they've got some food down in Moab, so we're going to pick up the family, and we're going to move them to Moab. Now, from the text, when you can look at some of these words in the original language, it doesn't give the feeling that they were going there to just stay. They were just going there for a time. It was always supposed to just be temporary until maybe they got word that, hey, there was food growing again in the promised land, and then they would go back. But you know how intentions go. So they intended to go and not really stay a long time, but that's the case. But I think we're starting to see some of the parallels here between what's going on in Judges and then what Ruth is kind of revealing for us. So, Moab. Why is that significant? So Moab is one of the kingdoms that were the oppressors of the Israelites during the book of Judges. So Moab becomes symbolic. It becomes a land of oppression, God's tool of judgment against Israel. So in Judges chapter 3, 12 through 14, we get this where, again, the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gave King Eglon of Moab power over Israel, and he attacked and defeated them. And then they served King Eglon of Moab for 18 years. So Moab, an instrument of God's wrath, I feel like it kind of had to sting a little bit to say I'm picking up my family and I'm leaving the land of promise because it was desolate, and head to the land of oppression and enslavement to try to find food. But as we remember, the land of promise was desolate only because of disobedience, and disobedience always has consequences. But our response in those trials, those response in those times matters. Our response in understanding who God is and that what he's still capable of matters. But we find in this story that we forget. They forget that God is still God. They recognize that God's judgment is upon them, but there doesn't seem to be an awareness that God's judgment was because of their disobedience. It was just, there's a famine. I need food. Let's go over here. So they seem to have forgotten. So things are bad, right? Unfortunately for them, they get worse. So when we go to verse 3, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. So now, the leader of their home, who have brought them into a foreign land, no indication here that this was God's judgment on him, but it certainly wasn't a positive outcome of the move to Moab. And then it gets even worse. As we look at verse 4, her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth, after they lived in Moab. We'll get to that part. All right, so her sons took Moabite women as their wives, full stop, right? Like, it's rough. We're talking about a law. There was a law against marrying women from outside of the Israelite community. Why? Because they would take them away from God. So, Deuteronomy chapter 7, do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. And the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. And then later in Numbers 25, while Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. So this is what Moab represented to the Israelites. Not a good place. So things are bad. But wait, there's more. So as we mentioned, they lived there 10 years. That's a long time for a famine to happen. But it says after about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. So now Naomi, no husband, no sons. Now today, right, we have a welfare system, we have different community setups. There's lots of different ways to take care of childless widows. But in the ancient world, the childless widow was among the lowest, most disadvantaged classes. There was no one to support you. And you had to live completely on the generosity of strangers. The closest we could get would be just a homeless person on the street who is left to just beg for money each and every day. This is essentially what her lot in life would be with no husband and no sons. It didn't matter that she had 2 daughters. Women in the culture were seen as little more than property. So they had no rights. And so by not having a husband or a male heir, there was no one to take possession of property that she had back home. So she's in complete despair. She doesn't know what to do at this point, right? I mean, I can't imagine being Naomi. I can imagine that she would say, when it rains, it pours. But way worse. Your future seems completely lost. Because for her, her future only would have been through her husband or her 2 sons. And with them all gone, in a land of oppression, not at home, she has nothing. She has no hope. So like the Israelites in Judges, she's in a deep, dark cell. It's pitch black. There's no hope. And she's just looking for a ray of sunshine. So most certainly, Naomi is in need of a redeemer. In the first 5 verses of this book, if you think about all the good things that as Christians we want to point to, God is great. God is gracious. God is merciful, right? God has all these promises. He does all the... We want to focus on all of the good things. But the reality is that life is not just made up of all good things. There are constant struggles. Sometimes the day-to-day, you get so lost in just a repetition of day to day. Sometimes it gets lost in what's the meaning? What's the purpose of all this? Surely God has something greater in store than just the everyday. And that can weigh on you over time when you don't see a light and when you don't see the hope. So I hate to leave it in a dark place, but that's where Naomi was. Probably felt like an eternity in a dark place. And I know the Israelites were in a dark place for a very, very long time. But if we've all read the book of Ruth, we know there's a happy ending. So we know what it is. But isn't that just like the Christian life? We know there's a happy ending. We know the end comes. We know Christ comes back. We know what that looks like. But yet, don't we too forget? We get lost in the moment, in the day-to-day struggles, in the tragedies that we see around us. And we forget. We forget about that victory that we have in Jesus. We forget that we know the end already. We know how the story ends, and yet we're still living like Naomi, lost and in despair and not knowing that God is even there working in the midst of it all. So I would encourage you before next Sunday, read it again. Read the whole book, won't take long. And focus on Naomi's plight and her situation and what is she dealing with. Don't read the text with yourself in mind. Don't read the text looking for yourself in the story. Read the text looking for God, for who he is and what he's doing in their life, in Israel's life. And then when you get to the end of the book, and you can turn over to Matthew chapter 1, everybody loves to read a genealogy. But be reminded of why Ruth is here, of why her name, a woman's name, was in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. In a society where that was frowned upon. Women weren't worth that. To be put in a list of names that led to our Savior, led to the Messiah. But yet, Ruth's name was among them. So I would encourage you this week to read that, and to look for God in the book. And then next week, it'll get a little brighter. Let me close this in prayer. Father God, I praise your holy name. That in every dark hour, there is always light. We may find that we are facing away from it, that we are cowering in the corner, that we're under our bed, that we're just trying to escape the monster, but all we're doing is keeping ourselves from the light that you freely give. God, I pray that your Holy Spirit speaks to every person here, that they feel the light of that hope in their life regardless of their circumstance, that even now, when we don't see it, that you are moving, that you are creating a path, that you are making a way to bring about good in any and all circumstances, God, because that's who you are. You are love. And you love us with this intensity that put your Son on a cross for our sins. So God, may we all be reminded of that as we go through this book of Ruth. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.